Dear audience, welcome to the first edition of a three-part meeting series at Spui 25, entitled Decolonizing La Mer Mortelle. My name is Jolande Jansen. I work at the Department of Philosophy here and also at the Free University. And I have organized this series together with Daniel Loik, to whom many thanks here. And we will be speaking with some very respected and interesting, nice colleagues. I will soon introduce them all, but I would first like to say something about the theme we are addressing. The Mediterranean Sea received this nickname, Mer Mortelle, more than 15 years ago, and it has since then only further become the center, but surely not the only location, of what are now the deadliest borders in the world, which are those of the European Union. More than 40,000 people have lost their lives during unsafe migration journeys since 2014 on the European borders. Our colleague Thomas Spijkerboer from the VU and his research team coined the term border deaths in this context. In the words of the International Organization for Migration, these data bear witness to one of the greatest political failures of modern times. The IOM and others involved thereby acknowledge that it is difficult to count the bodies, and they admit that the official numbers are probably even way too low. Apart from the people that have died and that die every day still, there are many people who live in uncertain and simply bad circumstances for years of their lives, either in asylum centers or camps or as illegals that are easily exploitable and always at risk of being deported, relatively invisible for European majorities, while enabling many of the goods and services they, and I should surely say we, include myself, consume. Finally, there are many people with non-European passports living and working in the EU who are, for example, our colleagues here at the university and who are faced with burdens of needing to take care of visa, filling in forms, legal documents, risking not to be able to go to conferences they would actually need to attend, having to plan their careers with their passports in mind to an extent that Europeans never have. And on top of this, they are regularly being talked about and addressed hardly as persons with whole lives, but rather as objects of do we need them or should we let them go or etc. This series of meetings will basically address the question of whether taking a perspective that centers colonial legacies and the fundamental critiques that have been made of them in various and rich decolonial literatures can help to rethink these fundamental problems in today's migration and refugeehood context, especially in connection to the Mediterranean as a border zone with long colonial and imperial legacies. Such decolonial perspectives could concern issues that have directly to do with policy, but also, and perhaps especially, rethinking what refugeehood and migration fundamentally mean, or to speak with Nuji Wa Djongo, what it could mean to decolonize the mind in relation to migration and refugeehood, perhaps especially the public mind of European majorities, but also of all of us. Critical voices increasingly argue that the situation at the European borders could only be possible due to the survival of coloniality, where the life of some people are considered so much less worthy than those of others that even feudal metaphors about structural and inherited hierarchies between people would hardly be enough to name the depth of the inequalities, but rather those of dehumanization, race, and what the Francophone Martinican author and politician Aimé Césaire called thingification, which he considered the essence of colonialism in his Discourse on Colonialism from 1950, where some citizens, especially perhaps or surely white citizens, are considered free subjects, while others are considered as things whose emotional and intellectual lives are more or less irrelevant. Most recently, the agreements about African migrants with Tunisia made by the EU, initiated by the Dutch government in cooperation with Italy, after warnings for grave human rights violations from many sides, seem to be a case in point. But also this course is focused on labor migration that are mostly focused or focused alone on what we need in the near future could be part of this. More and more it is asked, what are the colonial and racial dimensions of these policies and discourses, and how can decolonial theory and practices help to improve or structurally transform them? In this first edition of Decolonising La Mer Mortelle, we center the experiences and ideas of refugees themselves to explore alternatives for today's lethal situation. We could suggest that this is often the case, but media and other outlets are often about the stress and suffering of helpless people, while European actors are then presented as the we that take the initiative to help or repair. The question then could be specifically, how could we get out of the current dynamic in which public empathy surges at dramatic moments, but is then often succeeded by policies that supposedly prevent dramas, yet actually often worsen refugees' situation? Our speakers today will focus on the possibility of alternative approaches. We will start with a column read by Fahad Alizadeh, who lives in Paris and lived in Lesbos and Thessaloniki as a refugee before. He is joining us through Zoom. We will then pass the word to Shaheen Naziri, who is working at the UvA as a PhD candidate and also connected to the University of Wageningen and soon to the University of Tilburg. He will address the phenomenology of freedom from refugees' perspective. And if you find his talk interesting, tomorrow he is defending his PhD thesis at 11 o'clock here next door in the Lutherse Kerk. So please feel welcome, all of you. Then we will hear Sandro Mezzadra, who is going to be talking about the autonomy of migration. He is a political theorist working at the University of Bologna, but anyone working, I think, in migration studies knows who Sandro Mezzadra is, because he wrote several very important and interesting articles and a very good book, Border as Method. So we're very welcome that you are here. And if you want to hear Sandro again, please come tomorrow, because he will be asking a question to Shaheen. Then lastly, lastly we are going to hear Nadica Denic, who is going to talk about the decolonization of political, but especially about cultural imaginaries about refugees. And when we were talking here at the beginning, we were saying how important it would be, and also to have this lecture series to have cultural perspectives next to sociological, legal and political ones, and to bring them more into a conversation. So we're very happy that you're here too. And I could say something about the two next meetings very briefly. One will be on the 1st of November, which will be in Dutch, where we'll be talking very broadly about, if you take a decolonial perspective or try to define it, what kind of basic things should be the most important to change, and how could this possibly be the case, also practically. It's a very difficult question. One of the speakers who will hopefully be there then, sitting there at the back, Tamara van den Berg. And also Tesseltje de Lange is going to be speaking then, and she is going to be there tomorrow on Shahid's committee as well. And then the last meeting is going to be held in December or January, where among the speakers will in any case be philosopher of science and technology Huub Dijsselbloem, who wrote a long and very interesting book about infrastructures of migration recently, and Leila Fakfoui Azar, who is sitting over there, and it will be about technological and other infrastructures of migration and how they direct outcomes for migrants that maybe nobody would want, but that are still there. So it's going to be about infrastructures of migration and also of mobility, but also of immobility. All right, thanks a lot. Please.
All right. Yeah, we have some technical problems, but that's fine. This happens to these kind of conferences. So thank you all for being here, and please, first of all, allow me just to thank Yolanda for organizing this series of events, and as well as Aspire 25 just for supporting this series of events. We hope that these discussions are going to have some impact, or perhaps it would be a kind of a humble contribution to the migration debate, which in my view has been unnecessarily and unfortunately been polarized by and degenerated by party politicians, media, the mass media, but also all kinds of propagandists in Europe. So before I start my talk, I wanted just to actually pose a question to you guys, an easy question. I was wondering how many of you guys actually hold a passport, or whether you consider yourself as a national citizen of a particular nation state. Please raise your hand if you are a national citizen of a particular nation state. Yeah, I see almost, everyone is raising one's hand. So that's, in fact, my talk is going to about this almost seemingly self-evident fact. And I want just to problematize this seemingly self-evident fact. The fact that we are all born as citizens of a nation state, that we are all born as national citizens of a particular country and enjoy the rights and freedoms granted to us by that country, and that although we might travel and work here and there, we still possess a passport of a certain nation state and will eventually die as a citizen. For many of us, the legal, political, and conceptual boundaries of nation states might appear as natural as angels would appear to a medieval soul. However, behind this wall of appearances, a sheer truth lies hidden. Yes, I mean the truth of millions of refugees like Farhad and all of those who are born, live, and die in permanent statelessness, extended exile, and a state of abandonment. At present, refugeehood constitutes the normalized mode of existence of a growing number of people who do not fit within the boundaries of nation-state paradigm. To use a Marxian metaphor, one could suggest that a specter is haunting the globe, but not this time the specter of communism, but the specter of refugeehood and mass migration. So in the mainstream political discourse, refugees are increasingly being reified and portrayed as undesirable masses, as numbers, as floods, troublemakers, profiteers, and even potential terrorists who pose a threat to the stability, welfare, and sovereignty of nation states. What has become less and less relevant in this securitized narrative of migration is that refugees are our equals, that they are human beings who have their own aspirations, dreams, personal goals, ideals, and lived experiences of freedom and unfreedom. In fact, when I was at the very early stage of my research project, some established political theories, well-known ones, I'm not going to mention their names, of liberal and humanitarian inclination, were hesitantly asking me why refugees' experiences of freedom would matter to philosophers at all, and in what way they would differ from their well-established theories of freedom. After all, the Refugee Convention tells us that refugees are victims of persecution who need the protection of liberal states on humanitarian grounds. Conventional and humanitarian approaches to refugee would envision a refugee as someone who is subjected to persecution by a state or a state-like actors in their homeland. These approaches reduce refugeehood to a temporary and exceptional state that should transform into national citizenship, either through inclusion or exclusion, and they have fancy terms for this, the legal processes of naturalization and repatriation. And in this binary scheme, refugees are considered as victims of persecution who should be offered protection and humanitarian assistance in extraordinary moments of emergency. And this humanitarian framework is premised on liberal and state-oriented conceptions of freedom, and interprets persecution as life-threatening forms of coercion and domination. It depicts refugees as absolute victims and conceptually locates them in the domain of unfreedom. A refugee is a victim of coercion and domination on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group, and these are the categories that are laid out by the Refugee Convention. And it should be also stressed that, I mean, the Refugee Convention, which is the only, I mean, internationally recognized standard that we have in order to talk about refugeehood on the legal grounds, they restrict the legal meaning and applicability of the concept of persecution by excluding events or situations such as famine, civil war, environmental disasters as well-founded grounds for seeking asylum. And in fact, if there is one thing that experiences, practices, and the struggles of refugees, migrants, and other people on the move highlight is that this humanitarian framework is way too narrow and reductionistic to account for the mass phenomenon of refugeehood we encounter in every corner of the world. At present, mass flight of refugees is primarily rooted in and caused by failure of nation states, neo-colonial proxy wars, humanitarian interventions, extreme forms of economic deprivation, and environmental catastrophes. For over 3 decades, most refugees flee from the so-called failed states and conflict zones. According to the UNHCR, more than 2/3 of all refugees worldwide come from just 5 countries, which are, I mean, quite interestingly categorized as failed states. In 2022, 76% of refugees and these displaced people under UNHCR's mandate, about 16 million people, were in protracted refugee situations for 5 years or more. Of this group, about 6 million people were in permanent state of exile for 20 years or more. And people who are trapped in these situations are abandoned to the very margins of society and are prevented from gaining access to proper housing, legal employment, education, healthcare, and systems of justice. During my phenomenological fieldwork in the refugee camps and conversations with refugees, I realized that although the fear of persecution in the narrow sense is one of the potential reasons for flight, it's by no means the foremost reason for people to undertake a life-threatening journey with an uncertain outcome. In most cases, the conventional definition of persecution played a marginal role in the way many refugees gave meaning to their own pre-flight and post-flight condition. And I also realized that the exposure to structural rejection, political and legal neglect, and placelessness embody different aspects of lived experiences that refugees associate with unfreedom. And to do justice to these lived experiences, I draw on the notion of abandonment and underscore that mass flight of refugees and migrants stem from various social, political, economic, and environmental factors which correlate with failure of nation states, the nation-state paradigm as such, climate change, humanitarian interventions, neo-colonial proxy wars, and permanent statelessness. And from this point of view, abandonment could be defined and understood as a human condition in which one is exposed to juridico-political rejection and a spatio-temporal neglect, and thereby is prevented from attaining an equal and consistent place in the world. And in the juridico-political sense, it describes the human condition of people who are systematically exposed to legal insecurity and political practices of rejection and neglect without necessarily facing life-threatening coercion. And in the spatio-temporal sense, abandonment represents structures and arrangements in which a human being is prevented from obtaining an equal and consistent place in the world. Let me try to illustrate the condition of abandonment by having a closer look at the experiential account of refugees. In this regard, the personal life story of Mina, a young undocumented Afghan migrant who was born and raised in Iran, is worthy of examination. She described her pre-flight situation as follows, and I quote, "When I was in Iran, I was not even allowed to buy a SIM card. To do so, I had to ask an Iranian to buy a SIM card for me and register it under her name. Although I was for some time allowed to go to school, the Iranian authorities could arbitrarily change the rules for Afghan migrants and ban them from schools. My dream was to become a biologist, but they prevented us from finishing high school. Many of my friends were talented. The only crime we had committed was to be undocumented Afghan migrants. When the Iranian authorities do not let you to go to school, it means that they are condemning you. I never forget the day that they prohibited me and my friends from going to school. This was one of the main reasons why I left Iran. There were no consistent laws or regulations for us. I did not want for my children to face the same destiny." As we can see, Mina's pre-flight condition is determined by constant exposure to juridico-political abandonment in one's own birthplace. It is marked by the absence of a purposeful future due to an unstable juridico-political status. For this woman, flight is motivated by a deep-seated desire of negating a situation in which one must pass on one's own legal position of statelessness to one's own children. And let me give you a final example by looking at the lived experience of Liam, a Kurdish refugee. In his self-perception of his pre-flight condition, he offers important insights into spatio-temporal dimensions of abandonment and flight. And I quote, "I have never had a home. I lived in Iraq for 25 years. We changed 9 camps all the time. We were afraid. We were just moving from one to others, from place to place. We changed our camps under difficult conditions. In Iraq, I had no home. We lived in camps and tents. When I made the decision to flee from the refugee camp in Iraq, I told my family, I know that I might die during this journey, but I will go. It's better to die on one day than to die every day." In his lived experience, the act of flight marks the negation of the state of abandonment and socio-political death. Liam's interpretation of flight attests that unfreedom is not passively internalized, but rather it is actively resisted by strategies and practices which pave the way for experiencing and enacting freedom. To become free, one must decide between being socially dead or undergoing a life-threatening journey. For Liam, the everyday experience of unfreedom should be halted at all costs. He was prepared to sacrifice his biological life, a risk that not all his fellows were ready to take. Flight is therefore not a desperate undertaking of an anxious victim that constantly fears persecution, but rather a courageous and deliberative act towards creating a situation in which one could be free. Viewed from this interpretive angle, refugees' act of flight is an emancipatory undertaking for breaking the cage of unfreedom and abandonment. Flight is a liberatory act that manifests itself in movement, border crossing, and transgression of boundaries of nation-states. The act of escape frees refugees from the suffocating force of everyday abandonment without providing any guarantees or assurances. The act of flight and escape allows refugees to move from the state of non-existence to political existence, and creates the possibility for them to claim an equal and consistent place of refuge in the world. Thank you.
So I'm happy to be here. I'd like to start by warmly thanking Yolande for the invitation. And I also thank Shaheen for his speech today, but also for writing an excellent and challenging, politically engaged PhD thesis. I look forward to discussing it with him tomorrow. We are gathered here to discuss La Mer Mortelle, which means the Mediterranean. And I guess we all know what the Mediterranean has become over the last couple of decades, which means, to put it in a very sober way, a mass graveyard. There is a need to contextualize the Mediterranean within wider geographies of bordering and migration. And you know, the first place that comes to mind from this point of view is the border between the US and Mexico. When we started to work on the Mediterranean, on the external frontiers of the European Union in the 1990s, the US-Mexico border was a kind of necessary reference for us. And there was a great feminist, lesbian, Chicago writer and poet, Gloria Anzaldúa, who published in 1987 a really crucial book, Borderlands/La Frontera. And in that book, she describes the border between Mexico and the US as a a kind of line of contact where the third word grates with the first word and bleeds. It is a very effective image, and it continues to speak to us. But I think there is a need to add that today such conflicts surrounding borders happen in many places in the world, well beyond the north-south divide. Just to make one important instance, think of the Bay of Bengal, that over the last 10 years have become a kind of borderscape where Rohingya refugees fleeing from Myanmar encounter bordering practices and devices that remind us of what happens in the Mediterranean. I think this is important because it says something about the shifting geographies of migration and borders in the contemporary world. I was asked to say something about the autonomy of migration approach. I do it, of course, but I have to say that for me, the autonomy of migration approach has never been a kind of grand theory that explains everything. I often wrote that the autonomy of migration is a kind of gaze, is a way to look at migration, at borders, is a way to look at conflicts and struggles surrounding borders in the contemporary world. And of course, the question of subjectivity, of migrants and refugees' subjectivity is crucial here. The autonomy of migration approach took shape between the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the new century, precisely to criticize the prevailing humanitarian approach to migration and borders. And we took a critical distance from the prevailing representation of migrants and refugees challenging borders as mere victims. We were, and we continue to, emphasize the subjective stakes of movements of migration. And what does subjective stakes mean? We do not have in mind a kind of heroic representation of subjectivity. Subjectivity in the Mediterranean is fragmented, you know. What you are confronted with when you meet people on boats are subjective attempts, subjective struggles, subjective practices that aim at reinventing freedom, as Shane was saying before. I think this is an important point. I continue to emphasize the relevance of this point. But of course, to criticize victimhood does not mean to deny the processes of domination, subjection, racialization that target people on the move and that too often produce death. The autonomy of migration approach has been often criticized for romanticizing migration. And maybe in some cases this critique was justified. As far as I am concerned, I took it seriously, and I always emphasize the fact that the autonomy of migration implies a specific way to look at the root causes of migration, and not at all denying their relevance. It's a point of view on the structural determinants of migration, a point of view that attempts to shed light on the possibility of criticizing those determinants in an effective way. Let me conclude by making two more points. Our discussion today is focused on the Mediterranean. And you know, over the last years, there has been a growing activism in and on the Mediterranean. You may be familiar with what is called the civil fleet, the civil rescue ships that operate in the Mediterranean. Around the ships, there are hundreds and hundreds of activists that engage on a daily basis in struggles against the violence of borders. This is, for me, very important, and I participate in this activism. At the same time, I think we should be aware of the fact that we need to connect what happens in the Mediterranean with wider processes of transformation that are reshaping both the European space and the spaces from which migrants and refugees flee. This is, for me, a very important point. We cannot simply and exclusively focus our critical analysis on processes of illegalization. Because if we do that, if we just focus on the figure of the illegalized migrant and refugee, we end up reproducing at the cognitive level the processes that produce precisely that illegalization. We have to look at the manifold connections between processes of illegalization and attempts to regulate labor migration. We have to get a wider picture of the way in which this criminal politics of migration management is connected with the dynamics of European citizenship, of European labor markets in a conjuncture of capitalist transition. This is important from the point of view of research, but it is vitally important from a political point of view. The autonomy of migration must not mean the isolation of migrants. We have to fight against the isolation of migrants, and to do that, we need to establish connections both in our research and in our political practices. A last point. The title of this series of meetings is Decolonizing La Mer Mortelle. And let me say something about the issue, the unaccomplished project of decolonization. Yolande has already mentioned some important references from this point of view, starting with Aimé Césaire. My question to all of us is how does decolonization appear in a conjuncture in which we are confronted with an emerging multipolar world, in a conjuncture in which the end of Eurocentrism seems to happen in ways that are completely different from the ones that have been imagined by anti-colonial and post-colonial thinkers, including myself. Think of the Mediterranean today. Of course, the primary responsibility of what happens in the Mediterranean is a European responsibility, and we have to look at the way in which European policies in the Mediterranean reproduce colonial and imperial legacies. But in order to understand what is happening today in the Mediterranean, we also have to keep track of the presence and the role of, say, Russia, Turkey, Egypt, the Gulf states. You know, this makes the picture much more complicated, and we have to test our notion of decolonization, our desire of decolonization against a background that is significantly changed with respect to the one of 20 years ago. Well, I leave it here. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Yolande and Daniel, for organizing this. And thank you all for being here and for wanting to join this conversation on decolonization and migration. What I would like to do today is propose approaching cinema as a homemaking practice. That will be my main aim. Before that, I'm going to start with a few observations about the relation between coloniality, migration, and media. When watching the European news media coverage of migration, we often see a common frame, that of crisis. Migration and border crossing are commonly portrayed as crisis events that are worthy of European public's concern over the protection of the external and internal borders of Europe against illegalized migration. The two main representations of the migrant subject, which currently operate in such a narrative, are that of, on the one hand, a victimized refugee who is conditionally deserving of European benevolence, as we have also heard from the previous two speakers, and on the other hand, a criminalized migrant who is considered a threat to European culture, economy, and security. While migrants are not necessarily excluded from participation in the production of knowledge of migration, previous research suggests that their inclusion is often conditional, which means that they are not given the opportunity to set the terms of the conversation about migration themselves. Rather, migrants' testimonies are often recontextualized to fit the concerns of European publics. I want to propose conceptualizing such a mediated production of knowledge, including the manner in which migrants are positioned within it as one of coloniality of media. While this issue can be tackled from many different angles, I want to focus today on the position of migrants in the production of knowledge of migration and how media can be used to create spaces of belonging in Europe. So the main question I'm asking today is, how can migrants intervene in the coloniality of media, and in doing so contribute towards the process of decolonizing migration? I will focus today on first-person films about migration, which are films made by filmmakers who use cinema to express and critically engage with their own experiences of migration. In many cases, this involves documenting their own migration journeys, or, for example, life in one's country of origin or life in Europe. Such films are not new, but we have seen their proliferation in the last decade, including, for example, 2 films that had theatrical release in the Netherlands, like Baud Al-Khateb's 2019 film For Sama, which focuses on the filmmaker's decision to migrate from Syria to England, or Louis Hot Hot Hot's 2021 film For Journeys, which focuses on the filmmaker's experience of belonging in between China and the Netherlands. The film I want to share with you today is Hassan Fazili's 2019 film Midnight Traveler, which focuses on the filmmaker's 3-year-long journey from Afghanistan to Germany after being marked for death by the Taliban. Hassan Fazili embarked on this journey with his partner, Fatima Hosseini, and their 2 young daughters, Nargis and Zara, in 2015. They reached Germany in 2018, where they struggled for multiple years to obtain asylum, and they now reside in the US. One way to approach Midnight Traveler and other first-person films on migration would be to focus on their interventions on the representational level, which would involve reflecting on whose realities are being represented and whose realities are being denied. I would, however, like to propose to understand these films not only as representations of reality, but as practices during which reality is negotiated to create spaces for one's own personal and critical expression of belonging. Can the space of media, in this case of the medium of film, be transformed into a place of home and belonging, a place where citizenship is achieved rather than received? Such an approach would require from us to attend to first-person filmmaking as a cultural practice by which citizens, regardless of their legal status, intervene in the public sphere to achieve a sense of belonging in it. In line with the other speakers, I would like to pick up on the theme of autonomy and freedom by reflecting on how cinema can become a homemaking practice that allows migrants to negotiate autonomy during the process of migration. In this way, by thinking with Midnight Traveler, I propose to consider the film as not only a testament to the filmmaker's regrounding of a home, but also an example of how the process of filmmaking itself can be considered as a homemaking tactic, a practice of navigating belonging by critically engaging with one's experience of migration. I will show 2 clips from the film and discuss them, but if you would like to see the whole film, you can stream it online. In the Netherlands, you can stream it on Cinetree, and in other countries, you can stream it on other platforms. The first scene that we are going to see is the opening of the film, and you can get a sense how the family introduces themselves to us as viewers.
Du var officiale per me? Adesso mi vedo. Non sei quello di Rosanna?
خب شدی بازم یکم خلقتی چرا؟
میخوام از کتابی که پدرم برای خودش میخونه من برای شما یک چیز بخونم. کتاب اژدهای خودی فصل اول رهگذر نیمه شب. شخصی را به خاطر دارم که در شهر بزرگی اقامت داشت و اندیشیدن را پیشه خود گزیده بود. کلید اسرار زندگی و رموز سرچشمه وجود را سالیان دراز در گرد خاک اوراق و کتب جستجو کرد و بالاخره روزی گفت جهنم عبارت است از دیگران. فکر نمی کنم چنین باشد. سیاحت در دشت و بیابان به من چیزها آموخت و عبور از ریگستان پرده ها از حقایق برداشت. از آن جمله یکی این که راه به سوی سرچشمه زندگی از جهنم عبور می کند و دیگر این که جهنم عبارت است از خود و این است ماجرای سیاحت تا آستانه جهنم.
In the film, the family members take turns in filming their journey with 3 different mobile phones, as well as narrating it through the voiceover in the film. The opening scene that you have just seen functions as a prologue of the film, in which the footage that was shot at different stages of their family life is compiled together with the images from their migration journey. These images are home videos. They document different ways of being at home, but also different ways of enacting a home. While home is often thought of in contrast to migration as something one leaves behind as a migrant, the prologue's unity of home videos shot at different moments and places shows that the family's home is not embedded in one place, but rather continuously enacted at different places, including at those where one's mobility is contained. Narrated over wired border fences, as you have just seen, the prologue introduces the film as a journey to the edge of hell, where hell is to be found around oneself, but also within oneself. The film addresses both the migration experiences that make their journey hell-like, but also how those experiences have the power to distort their outlooks on life and on themselves. So the second scene that we will see focuses on the latter. In that scene, the family is in a refugee camp in Serbia, where they had to wait for a long time to legally enter Hungary, after they have already been on the road for almost 3 years. And the focus of this scene is on the sudden disappearance of their youngest daughter, Zara.
من خیلی خوشحالم که فیلم سازم. خیلی سینما رو دوست دارم، ولی گاهی سینما اونقدر کثیفه. اتاق ما رو عوض کردن. ما در حال اساس کشی بودیم. هوا داشت غروب میشد. یک دفعه فاطمه گفت که زهرا کجاست؟ بعد چند نفر پرسیدیم که فلانی زهرای ما رو ندیدی؟ زهرای ما رو ندیدی؟ با زهرای ما رو ندیدی؟ هیچ کس زهرای ما رو ندیده بود. من به فاطمه گفتم که چند دقیقه شده که زهرا نیست؟ گفت تقریبا 1 ساعت شده. همه که این رو گفت خیلی نگران شدم. و 1 هفته قبل از این چند نفر در آلمان یک دختر تجاوز کردن و کشته بودن. همه فکرها همزمان یک دفعه به ذهنم رسید. بیشتری مردم کمپ بسیج کردیم. این طرف بگرد اون طرف بگرد. اتاق با اتاق گشتیم، اونجا نبود. خیلی نگران شدیم. من رفتم زیر درخت‌ها رو گشتم. من رفتم زیر سبزی ها رو گشتم، اصلا ناراحت بودم، از خودم بدم میاد که من چرا زیر سبزی رو میگردم. یک لحظه من یادم آمد که عجب صحنه‌ای داری بازی میکنی، تو داری زیر درخت میگردی. اینه میگفتم بهترین صحنه فیلم این میشه. شاید همین دوربین گفتم دوربین روشن کن، همین که دنبال زهرا میگردی با دوربین روشن دنبال زهرا بگرد. اینا همه در یک لحظه بزن، فکر نکردم درباره، تمرکز نکردم، یک لحظه شاید به ذهنم رسید. یک لحظه دیدم مثلا زهرا، یک لحظه احساس کردم که جنازه‌ش دارم میبینم، خب، و فاطمه از اونجا داره میدوه، من دوربین دستم همون لحظه رو دارم فیلم برداری میکنم. یک لحظه دیدم، احساس کردم. اینقدر از خودم بدم آمد، خیلی از سینما بدم آمد و نتانستم. و زهرا پیدا شد.
At the crux of this scene is the filmmaker's confession of the urge to film his own family as endangered, and the belief that the creation of a scene in which the family is shown to have suffered the pain as immense as one of losing a child would elevate the film. If such a scene were to exist within this film, it would be used as a method to demonstrate the humanity of an individual or a group being filmed in a manner that complies to the European imaginary of a victimized refugee, so that no one could question the family's deservingness of European benevolence. When one's suffering and endangered life are used as means of humanization, this regulates our understanding of what it means to be human by constructing humanity as bare life, life that is stripped of its politics and placed within the possibility of danger, which offers a reductionist understanding of migration as well as excludes a multiplicity of reasons to migrate. One of the implications of Hassan's confession is that the imposed binary identities of the migrant subject as either a victimized refugee or a criminalized migrant are not mere discursive abstractions, but are rather reflective of the active processes of categorization, classification, and exclusion that shape migrants' realities. These processes reinforce hierarchies of difference in Europe by granting migrant subjects a place in the society on the condition of, in this case, being a suffering, passive, distressed, and powerless refugee, but not otherwise. As a result, as we have seen in this scene, migrants can feel compelled to perform this imposed identity in order to comply to the European imaginary of the migrant subject. The film, however, refuses the urge to comply to and perform the suffering that would be deserving of European benevolence. In contrast, the scene interrogates this urge to comply to it and closes with a bright image of Zara in the sun, smiling at the camera, laughing and running around the camp. In this manner, instead of turning Zara's vulnerability into a vehicle for humanitarian intervention, the documentary highlights her serenity and resilience in spite of her vulnerable position. Midnight Traveler thereby becomes a space for the family's negotiation of autonomy against and beyond the European borders regime's practices of categorization, classification, and exclusion of migrants. Let me now briefly return to my initial proposal to consider the first-person films on migration as not only representation of migration experiences, but also as tools that are used to carve out one's own space for expression and intervention in the coloniality of media. I understand Midnight Traveler as a space within which the filmmaker's family confronts a multiplicity of crises in the process of regrounding their home. The process of filmmaking and the film itself are active agents in the shaping of that reality to come. They are homemaking efforts that negotiate autonomy during the filmmaker's migration to Europe to create a place of belonging within the spaces they inhabit. Thank you.
In principle, we're now going to show the film after the Farhad has recorded a video with his talk, and that's what we're now going to try to show in any case. Let's see if it works.
Hello everyone. I came to Europe hoping to escape a country ruled by the dictator who controlled how I lived and what I believed. I thought Greece would be a place where I could live freely and have my basic rights in the land of mother of democracy. That was said by a refugee in Greece. When I arrived in Greece, where many refugees like me first landed in Europe, things got even harder. The camps on the Greek islands where we stayed were very crowded and not in a good condition. We didn't have clean water, proper shelter, and not even health care. Life was really tough. The Greek authorities did not provide a school or learning program. How can I understand what is the culture of the Greeks? How the people were locked in the camp without understanding the integration? I tried learning Greek without any support of government. Yes, I tried every day to learn a new culture that even did not respect me. With the support of the organization in the languages, at the end I ended up in a humanitarian, working in a different organization and helping people who were in the same situation as me and their daily lives without any information. While I was working in the organization, I saw the violence of the police, disrespecting of minors and females, how the people were treated like numbers and judged them by where are they from. I saw the father of the family from Syria who desperately wanted their children to go to a school, saying that I faced war, I couldn't go to a school, just accept my children. But that was not a challenge of his life. There was no official school for the people in the camp at the islands. The authority made it even harder for organization by reducing their access to the camp. Every day I saw children playing in the camp with no proper place to learn or grow. It was tough to watch because we expected them to be polite and respectful despite the difficult condition they faced. And I'm not going to say what would be the position of the children who spend their life in the closed camp. While in Europe, the politicians decided to reduce the number of the humans that they ask for help. Oh, sorry, bunch of immigrants and refugees. The Greek government started a new strategy, pushing back people illegally to Turkey, even with legal documents. Violence started by unknown persons against of the families. At the border or even in the mainland, middle of the city, they were arresting people, taking them to the nowhere, robbing them, taking their cell phone, making them naked in front of their families and their children, and sending them back to the Turkey at the middle of the midnight. Lots of people in the boats, they have been pushed back by destroying the engines of their boats. Many of them have been killed because we don't want any more humans, that they can have different culture living beside us. We claim to be open-minded, but do we let people die because of their culture is different? I recently became culture mediator at Thessaloniki. In one session of my job, I remember I gave a paper to a 9-year-old child to paint or draw something for himself while I was talking with his father. And he drew up a man on the floor when 2 policemen were standing beside of him. And I asked him, who are they? He said, it's a policeman that they are beating my father. And I think it's gonna be the trauma of the child growing up in the 3rd decade of 21st century. Thank you everyone for listening.
So we do not have that much time anymore, so we are not going to comment on each other and just open for a Q&A. So is there anyone who would like to bring up something or ask something or discuss? It's one of our students who recently wrote an MA thesis on migrant detention.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I've had a really long day at work, but I'm going to think of something. First of all, thanks to all of you for your presentations. I found them to be very interesting. I think mostly, Shaheen, what I was wondering about your research, because I know that you've interviewed people, you were talking about this notion of freedom freedom as being to flee, to move, and there's like an inherent idea of movement in there. But then I was also wondering, also because I wrote my thesis on the experience of immigration detention, and there's also this idea of being stuck, not being able to move. I think the same goes for a lot of the camps that migrants are being held in, even though maybe formally they're allowed to go somewhere, but in practice they can't. So how does that connect to this idea of freedom as being able to move because they're stuck in these camps, they're stuck in detention?
All right. Yeah, you want me just to respond now? Okay, thanks a lot for this important question. In fact, Farhad was one of the participants of my research project. So I think in his narrative, we in fact see the spatial but also socio-political practices that amount to refugees' unfreedom. We see practices of violence, encampment, but also sheer domination and coercion. But on the other hand, it is also important to emphasize, and this is also the theme of our discussion on the autonomy of migration, that, I mean, these practices, these arrangements, they only actually determine or delineate one partial dynamic of what we understand under migration and how refugees, in fact, experience their own life as, in this case, as camp dwellers, but also as people on the move. So when I just talk about the dynamic relationship between freedom and unfreedom, and it is important just when we want just to reconceptualize refugee, particularly from the standpoint of the autonomy of migration approach, it is important to emphasize that refugees do not, experience or perceive or practice freedom in a kind of a power-free situation. They enact their freedom specifically as a kind of a strategy or counter-strategy against practices that lead to their unfreedom. And flight is one of those practices and lived experiences which gives actually just moving from place to place. So in the case of Farhad, he was an undocumented migrant living in Iran for more than 25 years. He was not allowed to go to school. But he decided by his purposeful act of flight, he just moved to Greece in a country in which he gained more freedom because of this act of flight, this act of movement. But what is denied to refugees, and we have to also emphasize this, and you also mentioned the notion of romanticization of autonomy of migration, and we should be aware of the fact that refugees have to flee Because of the fact that they don't have the right to free movement, which has been denied. So although they have, I mean, if you read the Refugee Convention or the Declaration of Human Rights, they have the right to seek asylum, but there is no single right which gives them the right to cross borders. And so by fleeing and crossing those borders, and in fact by transgressing legal determinations of borders, they enact their freedom. So that's how I see. I myself have actually tried to understand how these refugees as a kind of a fragmented subjects, or I call them non-subjects in brackets, how they actually experience freedom in those spaces where they actually are exposed to all kinds of arrangements of unfreedom. I hope this answers your question.
Thanks. Dennis. Yeah, do. All right.
Thank you. My question is also, sorry to bring that, the romanticization. I don't want to be another person that just puts a nail on that. But this is something I'm also struggling. This idea of that refugees have this negative capability that they have this power to bear the burden of mystery, you know, like this idea that they cross seas and their fear is not overcome, not only by the hope of a better life, but by also accepting this darker alleys that comes with it, and then they disturbs or disrupt this binaries of nation state, not binaries, but just disturbing the nation state. And then how can we, because you say that we have to bring fragmented side of humanity to them, to show the complexities of the human life, and then one can do that through cinema and so on. But then when you say, not you, but when a person says, oh, we have to show the contradictory side of it, then there's, in my experience or in my reading, there's this issue of not being consistent. And not being consistent has always been kind of the definition of subjectivity in the Western sense, that you have to be consistent to be a human being. So who can be allowed to be contradictory? Because when we say like that, oh, we are human beings, the human nature, I do this, I say this, I do something else. But then when this contradictory is given, afforded to certain humans, but not to others, and then how do we move on from that? By, not just by saying that let's give more voices, let's just put the cinematic practices to show the different subjectivities. But then again, this contradiction and inconsistency that does not allow a certain subjective to arise. And I know
is that a question to Sandro?
Yeah, maybe it's Sandro, I don't, yeah, but it's a big question and I don't want to...
Or to Nelsa.
Yeah. But then if that makes sense a bit, yeah. Thank you, by the way.
Well, thank you very much. I repeat that I take seriously the criticism of the autonomy of migration approach for romanticizing migration. And if I go back to what I was writing about migration 25 years ago, I can see that such a criticism may be at least partially justified. But I tried to take stock of the criticism, and I quickly changed, in a way, my perspective on the autonomy of migration, and particularly on the question of subjectivity. It may be, you know, in the 1990s, Italy became a country of immigration in a very quick way. So we were not accustomed to deal with migration. As you know, Italy had been for decades a country of mass emigration. You know. And I was, as an activist, working with many other activists, confronted with a challenge. And most people around me in the left were looking at migration in a very paternalistic way, simply saying that migration is produced by neoliberalism, is functional to capitalism, and so on. Then we met many migrants, and we started to do politics with migrants in particular from Senegal and from Morocco, in the early 1990s in Genoa, the city where I was living at the time. And, you know, I was confronted with a completely different picture and experience of migration. These people were fighting in their daily life, not simply in a political way with banners, demonstrations, and so on. Their life was a struggle. And so maybe at the beginning I was tempted to see in migrants the kind of air of the subjectivity of the working class. Let's put it so, you know. But then I continued to work on migration. I continued to work with migrants. And as I was saying, I changed my perspective. And I started to conceive of subjectivity as a stake in migration. Meaning that if you look at what happens in the Mediterranean, you are not confronted with a consistent subjectivity of migrants. You are confronted with fragmented efforts, pushes, desires, attempts to free themselves, you know. And this is very important. This challenges also established views of subjectivity. And for me, the same is true with humanity. You are right. I mean, in this case, the question of colonialism plays an important role, of course. I mean, Aimé Césaire wrote important pages on this issue. In the Mediterranean, you see people whose humanity has been for a long time denied and continues to be denied through devices of racialization, technologies of domination, and so on. What does it mean to think of humanity from the point of view of people whose humanity has been denied for a long time and continues to be denied? This is the question that is raised by migration across the Mediterranean regarding humanity. I think it's an important question, you know. You know that in the academia, humanity is not considered anymore a kind of critical concept. It has been criticized for justified reasons. But then you go to demonstrations of refugees and you see these people with a banner, "We are humans." That has been for a long time a slogan in the African American movement in the US. We are humans. What do you say? Oh, you are naive because you don't know that humanity is connected to colonialism. I don't think this is the right attitude. I mean, it is much more interesting to think of the challenge to establish notions of humanity that banner encapsulates.
Thanks.
Thank you. As Sandra also mentioned, I think one way to access these subjectivities, I mean, there are many ways. Activism is one. Some form of conversations, interviews, oral history. I look at cinema, literature, social media. There's so many, I think, ways that migrants join or intervene in that public sphere. And I agree with you that it will always be limited and fragmented, how we can interact with that. But for me, it has been really important to try to think what kind of politics and what kind of ethics emerges from that. That has either been forgotten or neglected. I think autonomy has been an important part of that, but other things are as well. So I have also tried to work with the value of care and how also these cultural practices enact care or claim care towards migrants, but also, for example, opacity, which is maybe more relevant for the media or visual debate, where migrants are often rendered transparent. So how to reclaim the opacity of oneself. I hope that answers a bit.
I saw, Daniel, yeah. We have a few minutes.
So let's collect a few questions.
That's possible too. Yeah, but I don't think we have time for many questions. So, but Daniel, and you please also, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I think all three of you made the point against victimization and that victims and migrants and refugees are not victims but political subjects, and in your case, creative subjects that tell their own stories. And I wonder, really it's a follow-up on the previous question, I wonder how far you would go, because some political theorists, philosophers really would see migrants and refugees almost like the new revolutionary subject. You find this a little bit in Hart and Negri, I would say, also in Rancière, also in some parts of Agamben. And I think there is something to it, that you have a milieu or a space where people come together, forced, and oftentimes politicized people, oftentimes educated people, oftentimes people who learn how to, or know how to struggle. And then sometimes there's really the hope that at some point, also given that the number of refugees and migrants is increasing, there will be a new Spartacus that is able to organize these people, and then you have actually a political subject that is able to bring about fundamental political change. And I don't want to sound like dismissive of this view. I think there is actually something to it, but I wonder, what you three think of this hope, or how far you would go in rejecting victimization.
Could you please add your remark?
Thank you. I will be brief. My name is Esther, and I was thinking about your start, Jolanda, about the largest political crisis of our time, and I wondered whether you have a reflection on, and also about the remarks on what was the growing activism at the Mediterranean, and I'm struggling with sort of the carelessness that I see also growing, the carelessness about this crisis. Why is it not being viewed as the huge crisis, the political crisis that it is? But it might also be a question that is more suitable for the second event.
Well, it will return there, I think, but it doesn't mean that it's not. We couldn't address it now. Who would like to speak to Daniel Loic's a question or remark, or to Esther's? Maybe we can just. What would you like? Do you have?
Go ahead. I will follow up on it.
I'm going to be brief. For me, this has not been. The aim has not been to negate victimhood, because I think there's a lot of strength in recognizing when one is a victim of oppression. I think for me it has been important that is not the only manner through which we see migrants. But I think that is also the view of autonomy of migration in general.
Yes, thank you, Daniel, for your question. We don't have much time, so let me say that I'm wary of theories that portray the migrant as the revolutionary subject. There is a tendency to reduce the migrant to an icon, to a figure, and too often, by doing that, the materiality of migration goes lost. What I think is that migration today is definitely one of the defining features of social, economic, political, legal dynamics in the world, not only in Europe and in the West. So it must figure prominently in any agenda of radical politics. But what remains the main problem for me is to establish a kind of intersectional grounds of convergence between different figures, different movements. So I ask myself which is the contribution that struggles of migration can make to that. And let me add that, as I was saying before, an exclusive focus on the figure of the illegalized or illegal, in quotes, migrant is too often leading to a kind of celebration of the isolation of migrants. If you read Rancière's book that was published 30 years ago, La Mésentente, what is really at stake in his book is the figure of the illegalized migrant. It's a great book. I have learned a lot from Rancière. But then, if I think of contemporary developments in migration and border studies, in critical migration and border studies, I see too often this tendency to kind of separate the figure of the illegalized migrant from the wider dynamics that produce processes of illegalization and that must be addressed to struggle against illegalization.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that's a very, I think, very relevant question because we are actually oscillating between two images of refugees, one of the absolute victims to, let's say, true subjects of revolutions. And in fact, I mean, the ideal image of refugees as revolutionaries is not quite, I mean, rare, because in the 70s and 80s, many refugees that fled from several countries, such as, I mean, from the Latin America, the Chilean refugees, but also all kinds of leftist resistance fighters that were fleeing from the different places of the world to the West. They were resistance fighters, so you could consider them as true subjects of revolution. But what's interesting to observe is that this ideal image of refugees of 70s and 80s, after the 90s, because of the fall of after the Cold War and because of the fall of the wall, we actually face another image of the ideal image of refugee, which is the absolute victim, the asylum seekers coming from the third world without any kind of subjectivity. So. But what I find quite, I mean, perhaps to subscribe to your point of view, is what I find quite revolutionary about mass migration is perhaps its abolitionist perspective. I mean, mass migration as such, not the refugees as individuals, because they have all kinds of reasons to flee. They have different backgrounds, they have different socio-economic backgrounds, political ideals. But mass migration as such has a kind of an abolitionist potential, because by transgressing all these borders, I mean, you can just erect the walls, but at some point you're just going to break them. I mean, that's what happened, I mean, with the abolition of slavery as well. I mean, by the mass practices of marronage, by fugitives also challenge those racial borders. And I think that's where we should look for the revolutionary potential of mass migration. Thank you.
Thanks. I would like to get back to your question. You said it's this whole political crisis in a way is getting out of view, and I think that has to do with the fact that there are so many other crises asking for a lot of attention too, and it gives also maybe an opportunity to address migration more in connection to other big troubles. So it's maybe also a possibility also to connect to what you said, a more intersectional and structural analytical approach. So in that sense, maybe there's also some possibilities there. And maybe also in a political context, I don't know, this is just speculative what I'm saying, but I once heard an analysis from a communications scholar, and he said it doesn't matter what people are saying about migration in a public context. Every time the word migration is mentioned, this means a vote for Wilders. At that point, it was 5-6 years ago, I think. So in that sense, politically, if migration becomes less addressed as the problem or one of the problems that we have, as we see now in a sort of shifting discourse, in the Netherlands, for example, in the direction of the elections, it could also give some space for having it out of public focus a little bit. I'm not sure what you think about that, but I'm not so sure that getting out of media attention as the crisis to be addressed, if that is going to have per se, if that couldn't also have better or change something to the better. But we can maybe discuss that later, or maybe just staying here for a while, but in a more a more spontaneous conversation, because we need to finish now. And thank you very much to the audience, also for your patience with our small technological troubles, and also for maybe Farhad, who was not that easy to understand, but I think in the end we all managed to hear what he was saying, and it was very, I'm very happy we did that. Thank you very much, and I think we can stay around here for 5 more minutes and then we leave the building. Thank you very much for your attention. And you, oh sorry, and to the speakers, of course, thanks very much for being here.